Eric Adams, the voice bound to the imagery of warriors, mythology, and glory on the heavy metal stage, steps into the light as if he were part of the epic world Manowar has built over decades. When the sound rises, the hall changes instantly. Drums thunder thickly, guitars carve the path forward, and his voice stands at the highest point, pulling the entire space into a single emotional orbit. Yet behind the powerful range and the high-energy nights on stage lies a journey rarely told in its full measure. It did not begin in a professional recording studio, nor with an artistic family background, nor with a shocking breakthrough that announced his arrival. Everything started in a small town, with a guitar, local performances, and a path that had to be felt out step by step. What makes this story worth pausing for is not a single explosive moment, but the endurance that stretches across more than 4 decades, when one person chose to remain with the music, with the band, with the very structure that shaped him from the beginning. And it is precisely that seemingly simple choice that has formed a journey deep enough to revisit, about the cost of never changing direction, and about how a voice can endure for so long in a world that never stops shifting. Louis Marullo was born on July 12, 1952, in Auburn, New York, a small town where life moved at a steady pace through quiet streets and ordinary working families. He grew up without a professional musical background behind him, without a multi-generational artistic tradition, without a mapped-out path. His childhood followed the familiar rhythm of school, friends, and afternoons returning home, before music gradually entered as a different direction. At 9 years old, Marullo picked up a guitar. The first chords sounded within a private space, between repeated practice hours and fingers searching for the right positions along the fretboard. At that time, the sound was not connected to an audience or a stage. It was simply something that made the boy want to continue. The playing opened up a different space from the rhythm of daily life around him, one where trial and error became the most natural way to learn. The desire to make music formed through that very repetition. Evenings listening to the radio, rock bands of the early 1960s, images on television gradually shaped an idea, standing before others and singing. There was no professional mentor and no long-term plan, only the sense that music could become a central part of life. His apprenticeship, therefore, was direct. Marullo attended only a single vocal lesson, enough to grasp the basic principles of breathing. The rest was accumulated through performance and self-adjustment. Each time his voice grew tired, each time the sound wavered, he had to find a way to correct it himself. Technique did not come from textbooks, but from real stages, from a microphone placed in front of him and spaces that demanded to be filled by his own voice. It was a form of learning through collision, where experience was built through experiments and long nights of playing. In 1965, still a teenager, he and his school friends formed the garage band The Kids. Rehearsals took place in tight spaces, instruments placed close together, the sound thick and raw like the energy of youth itself. As they performed music for their own generation, carrying the spirit of rock and roll that was spreading at the time. In that setting, Marullo first experienced standing before an audience, feeling the direct response of a few dozen people in the room. The Kids released the song "Lovin' Every Day" and appeared on the album Class of '66. This milestone did not take him beyond the local sphere, but it confirmed something important. Music had moved beyond being a pastime. Recording and hearing his own voice played back created a clear shift from playing for fun to working more seriously with sound. Those early years shaped a consistent foundation, self-taught, self-built, without relying on industry backing. Small stages, close audiences, each performance a test of real ability. Among the later groups he joined was Looks, where he stood as lead singer and formed professional connections that would last into the future, especially with Joey DeMaio. Marullo's voice developed in a direct manner, focusing on force and rhythm rather than displaying complex technical flourishes. Each line was placed in real space, where the sound had to be strong enough to reach the listener. Over time, that way of working became a bodily habit. Step forward, raise the voice, hold the tempo until the end of the song. From Auburn to much larger stages years later, that original foundation, raw, practical, and grounded in experience, remained the quiet anchor for the entire journey. In 1980, Louis Marullo stepped into a newly formed band called Manowar. At that time, everything was still rudimentary: a small rehearsal room, makeshift equipment, an unstable performance schedule, and a group of people trying to define their sound in a heavy metal world that was vast and unpredictable. He took the position of lead vocalist from the very beginning, auditioning through long rehearsals, where each line had to find its place between the guitars and the drum beats. Ross the Boss suggested that he use a stage name when stepping into the spotlight. The name Eric Adams emerged from a very personal choice, combining the names of his two sons, Eric and Adam. When printed on posters and announced at early shows, it gradually replaced the name Louis Marullo, which had been familiar within local bands. From then on, each time he stepped before an audience, he no longer appeared as a singer hired for scattered performances, but as the figure standing at the center of a band, forming its identity. The early shows with Manowar took place in tight spaces, the sound not yet fully stable, but the energy clearer than before. He held the microphone longer, stepped closer to the edge of the stage, and his voice began to carry responsibility for the entire space in front of him. And it was no longer just about singing his part correctly. Each performance became an act of holding the rhythm for the whole collective, standing where the audience's gaze converged. The new name did not create a sharp boundary between two separate people, but the way he appeared had changed. Eric Adams gradually became the image associated with Manowar. On posters, in billing lineups, in introductions before the stage lights came on. From that point forward, his musical journey was tightly bound to the band's movement, beginning with rehearsals, road trips, and stepping onto stages in a role he would hold for decades to come. The early years after Manowar formed were marked by long journeys across Northern Europe, where the cold arrived before the sound did. The Scandinavian tours of the early 1980s took place under minimal conditions. No budget for hotels, no fixed rest schedule, only a single vehicle carrying around 16 people, the band and crew, moving through dark roads and freezing temperatures. Rare stops were made at gym facilities to shower, and then the journey continued before bodies had time to recover. After each night's performance, the van doors would close, cold air still clinging to jackets, the engine blending with the heavy breathing of those who had just left the stage. The space was cramped, the smell of sweat and metal mixed together. Some would fall asleep the moment the vehicle started rolling, others sat quietly, staring through fogged windows. Adams once said that if you believe in what you are doing, nothing can block your path. If an obstacle appears, you find a way past it, go around it, go through it, or push it aside. Life on tour moved in that way. Travel, set up the stage, perform, pack up, then get back on the road. He was present in that entire rhythm like every other member. When stepping before the audience, the microphone steady in his hand, his voice rose with enough force to fill the room, regardless of the long hours of travel behind him and the cold that had not yet faded. At one stop after a show, the vehicle came to rest. The others stepped out first, pulling equipment cases behind them. Adams paused for a few seconds at the door, his breath visible in the cold air, then stepped down, and merged into the flow of people moving forward. By the mid-1980s, Manowar's momentum began to shift in ways that were immediately visible on stage. Performances grew more stable. The sound expanded beyond small halls and appeared in larger spaces. The band's name was printed boldly on posters, and below it, familiar faces returned, standing close to the stage and singing along to every passage. Eric Adams's image became clearer through each night as part of that movement. He stepped out with the vocal approach he had already forged, maintaining force and rhythm, but his position on stage evolved over time. And the lights focused forward, the microphone always at the center, and his voice opened each song, drawing the hall into a shared tempo. Shows followed one another, audiences grew larger, the distance between stage and crowd narrowed. The early releases, along with accompanying tours, began to leave a distinct mark. The band's name appeared repeatedly in different places, the sound recognized even before introduction. In the crowd, listeners reacted sooner, raising hands, shouting along, keeping time with the band as songs reached their climax. The epic quality manifested through the very mechanics of the stage, thick drums, guitars pushing forward, and the voice standing at the highest point of the sound. Manowar gradually became a familiar presence within the metal community, and Eric Adams appeared within that same rhythm on stage, stepping out when the lights came on, raising his voice, then stepping back when the song ended, allowing the show to continue moving forward with the band and the audience. By the late 1980s, Manowar had moved beyond survival. The stages were larger, the sound systems heavier, the crowds below no longer unfamiliar. Familiar faces returned tour after tour, wearing shirts and carrying banners, standing close to the barricade and singing every memorized line. That bond was no longer a momentary reaction. It became a sustainable loop between band and audience. Eric Adams stood firmly at the center of the stage. Without theatrics, without imagery calibration, he simply repeated what he did best. Open the song and hold the rhythm for the space in front of him, let the voice pull the crowd into a shared orbit. Then the metal map changed. In the early 1990s, names that once dominated the classic heavy metal stage gradually disappeared from magazine covers. MTV shifted its programming. Festivals changed their lineups. The raw and shadowed sounds of grunge and alternative took over spaces once reserved for thick guitars and soaring vocals. Bands once considered symbols of an era were suddenly labeled with a different word: old. Manowar did not disappear, but they were no longer at the center of the current. Tours continued, but without the lights of mainstream media. No more dense clusters of interviews in print. No sense of a market expanding in their direction. Instead, there were loyal halls, familiar cities, communities that had chosen to stay from earlier years. That shift did not arrive as a single shock. It seeped gradually into the way the industry operated. Performance slots no longer in prime time, broadcast space narrowing, attention turning toward new faces. Manowar could have attempted to adjust, soften the sound, change the image, lower the epic intensity that defined them. They did not. Eric Adams continued to step onto the stage with the same vocal structure that had shaped his name. High ranges pushed to their full extent, and phrases held complete, force undiminished by shifting trends outside. In a context where many singers chose to lower themselves to fit new tastes, he maintained the same stance and the same delivery. It was a quiet, professional turning point. There was no defiant declaration, no shocking breakup, only a clear reality. They accepted no longer being part of the mainstream center in order to preserve the structure they had built for over a decade. The cost of that choice was a narrower sphere of influence. The reward was continuity, During the years when metal shifted, Eric Adams did not chase visibility. He chose to remain in his place, even as the spotlight moved elsewhere. And in that step back, his career entered a different state, no longer a climb forward, but a decision to stay. As soon as media lights moved away from classic heavy metal, the changes did not appear as a dramatic fall, but as very specific shifts in how the industry operated. Manowar's name no longer occupied prominent positions on major festival posters. Performance times moved later into the schedule. Interviews became less frequent. The press shifted attention to new sounds, new faces, new stories aligned with the direction of the market. Tours continued, but along a narrower orbit, revolving around communities already familiar. Halls did not disappear. They contracted, enough to sustain performance rhythm, enough to maintain connection, but no longer spaces where a name was pushed into the mainstream. Appearances no longer carried the sense of expansion, but felt like steady returns to known points. Eric Adams stepped onto the stage within that context with the same vocal approach that had defined him in earlier years. He did not lower the range, did not adjust to match new tastes. The voice retained its force, its pitch, its familiar structure, as if the stage in front had never changed. And within that refusal to change, the professional pressure became clearer. To remain, they had to accept standing outside the center. Manowar's working rhythm entered the 2000s in a state that had already stabilized. The studio reopened after each tour, new songs were completed, and then the journey resumed on the road. The band's sound did not stop at what had been recorded in the 1980s. New releases appeared, tied to tours stretching across multiple countries, keeping their presence continuous, uninterrupted by time. Within that movement, Eric Adams maintained his familiar position on stage. His voice carried through each night with steady force, supported by experience and a performance rhythm that had become bodily habit. Tours followed one another. Cities changed. Audiences changed. Yet the moment he stepped out, holding the microphone, retained the same structure, standing at the center, keeping time for the band, and letting the sound gradually expand into the space ahead. That image repeated over the years, long enough to become part of the live memory of the metal community. Music continued to be written and performed, while the crowd below the stage began to include multiple generations. Faces that had followed the band for years still appeared, standing beside those attending for the first time. The connection was maintained through reunion, through consecutive shows, through the audience recognizing the familiar sound from the very first notes. Through the 2000s and 10s, endurance became the most visible element. Eric Adams continued moving according to the tour schedule, continued appearing on stage in the same position, with the same way of holding rhythm that had been formed earlier. The Adams-Joey DeMaio axis continued to operate as the core of the band, keeping its direction from drifting. Personnel changes occurred over time, but earlier connections did not break. Some returned to contribute instruments to new recordings, like a thread extending from previous years. Adams's work remained fully tied to Manowar throughout that stretch. He did not branch out to build a large-scale commercial solo path, nor did he step away from the band's operating rhythm. Studio, stage, tour schedule, audience, everything connected into a familiar loop, where each new phase still began from what had been preserved. The performance rhythm sustained over many years left its clearest mark not on tour schedules or in studios, but on the body of the man standing before the microphone. Tours following one another, consecutive nights sustaining high notes, pushing the voice to its full range, and repeating it the next evening. All of it accumulated in ways not immediately visible. The throat grew tired and recovered. Breathing had to be adjusted with each stretch, and the body learned to conserve energy in order to make it through the show. There were moments when a high note had to be held longer than its natural capacity. There were nights when the voice no longer opened as quickly as before, forcing the singer to find another path to maintain force and tempo. Age did its work quietly. The upper range gradually narrowed. Some later recordings were lowered in key to match the current state of the voice. There was no tragedy, only adjustment in order to continue. Standing before the microphone during a show, he heard it more clearly than anywhere else. The breath rose but did not open immediately as before. The high note slowed by half a beat. The band continued playing. The crowd kept time. No one noticed anything different. Only he knew that the sound was no longer what it once had been. The show went on. He sang his part to the end, and the microphone lowered when the song finished. The night passed like so many others. Looking at the entire journey, vocal technique became a prominent axis mentioned repeatedly. At his peak, Adams's range spanned more than 4 octaves, from deep low notes to the signature high registers of epic metal. On stage, he could sustain high notes for dozens of seconds, creating a distinct mark in live performances. Ian Gillan had been an early source of inspiration, but Adams' vocal approach moved in his own direction, tied more closely to Manowar's musical structure than to repeating an existing model. Over the years, the body changed, the upper range diminished, and later recordings were lowered in key to suit present ability. The adjustment occurred quietly, linked to age and the prolonged rhythm of performance. Even so, the voice retained its recognizable traits: force, resonance, and the familiar phrasing each time it rose before an audience. Eric Adams' entire career remained tightly bound to his position within Manowar. For more than 4 decades, he did not leave the band, did not depart into large-scale personal projects. He stayed within the structure built from the early years. Brotherhood was not merely a slogan, but appeared in the way they moved, worked, and stepped onto the stage through each period. Within that structure, the connection between Adams and Joey DeMaio became the axis that kept time. Now, 2 individuals maintained the musical direction through many shifts in the market, not through attention-grabbing turns, but through the persistent repetition of one choice: continue moving, continue performing, continue preserving the sound shaped from the beginning. Each show followed another, each tour followed the next, and each time the lights came on, Eric Adams' voice sounded from the same familiar place, where he had stood for most of his professional life. Behind that operating rhythm was a private life almost entirely separate from the stage. When the lights went out, when there was no longer the structure of sound or the crowd in front, everything returned to stillness. A marriage that had lasted many years, a home kept steady, a clear boundary between performance work and family life. What belonged to the personal sphere was not brought forward, nor blended into the musical image. The 2 parts of life existed in parallel, without colliding. On one side were the journeys, the stages, the nights of music stretching across decades. On the other was a quiet rhythm, rarely mentioned, yet always present as the background to every professional decision. And perhaps it was precisely that carefully maintained distance that allowed him to remain steady at the front, and while the life behind him retained its stability over time. Family was present in a discreet but enduring way. His 2 sons, Eric and Adam, became private traces directly connected to his professional journey. The stage name, Eric Adams, was formed from those very names, not for symbolism or image strategy, but from a deeply personal choice. Each time that name was announced, it carried with it a part of the life behind the stage, where there were no lights, yet which was always there. His emotional life rarely became a public narrative. There were no confirmed scandals, no string of breakdowns displayed before the media, no legal records dragging public controversy behind them. That silence extended over the years, long enough to become a stable layer, separate from public attention. It was not emptiness, but a way of protecting a part of life that did not belong to the outside gaze. Beyond music, life unfolded in another direction. Hunting and the natural world became long-standing interests, leading him to the role of hunting guide in New York State. Days spent in the forest, tracking, listening, waiting in wide and quiet spaces, created a rhythm entirely opposite to the intensity of tours. From that came Wildlife and Wild Times, a DVD documenting the relationship between human beings and nature from an observational perspective, without display, without dramatization. Music occasionally touched this part of life in a gentler way. An acoustic album inspired by nature appeared, the sound restrained, no longer carrying the pressure of the stage or the familiar epic structure. The voice there did not need to be pushed to its limits. It only needed to exist within stillness and remain close to its original emotion. Throughout his family journey, there are no confirmed facts of major losses or shocking upheavals. The story moves through time with stability, quiet yet enduring. A paradox forms. The man who stands amid thick sound and high-energy stages keeps his private life in an almost still state, separate from the tense rhythm of the profession. After each tour ends, when the stage closes and the journey pauses for a brief moment, that part of life remains waiting behind. It does not need to be mentioned, does not need to appear in retellings. It exists as the ground for every decision, as the place to return to when the music finally stops. That stability allows him to continue stepping onto the stage over many years, while his private life remains intact, not swept away by the movement of lights and sound. And Eric Adams is remembered through the way a voice has retained its shape over decades. In the constantly shifting current of heavy metal, he held to the structure formed in the early years and followed that path along the same trajectory. That steadfastness appears in every performance, in the way the sound still carries its familiar force and resonance despite the passage of time. On stage, everything begins with rhythm and breath. Adams steps out, raises his voice, and the space ahead is immediately drawn into a single point of focus. The signature high registers of epic metal become markers of recognition, enough for audiences to identify within just a few opening notes. Multiple generations of listeners entered Manowar's world from that moment, carrying with them the sense of a sound that is wide, thick, and enduring. From there, his vocal approach gradually imprinted itself into the memory of the metal community as a natural standard. A line must carry weight, must travel its full distance, and must sustain energy to the final minute. More than 40 years tied to a single band create a particular kind of presence. The voice does not detach from the collective. Yes, it remains within the shared sonic structure and grows alongside it. Each tour continues the next. Each step before an audience extends the thread that was formed earlier. The work repeats in a familiar rhythm. Rehearse, record, perform, then begin again, long enough to become part of the shared memory of listeners. In the memory of the metal community, Eric Adams appears as an extended movement rather than a single moment. When Manowar is mentioned, the sound often arrives before the image. The voice opens the space, leads the audience through each song, then steps back when the music ends. The lights fade, the stage closes, yet that timbre remains. As a familiar part of performances that have passed and of the moments of singing that continue. In recent years, Eric Adams has continued to appear regularly on stage with Manowar, carrying on international tours and large-scale performances across Europe and the United States. At his current age, the performance schedule is adjusted to suit physical endurance, yet his role within the band does not change. Standing at the center of the stage, opening each song, keeping time for the entire show. Live performances reveal a clear shift in operation. Some songs are lowered in key to match his present vocal range. Set lists are rearranged in duration, but the performance structure remains intact. The audience is no longer only those who have followed the band since the 1980s. Many younger faces now appear in the crowd, singing along to passages that have become familiar across generations. The connection between Adams and Joey DeMaio remains the central axis of Manowar's operation. The two continue to guide performance direction, releases, and the way the band presents itself publicly. There are no signs of him leaving this position, nor are there any large-scale commercial solo projects being pursued in parallel. Off-stage, Adams' life maintains its own steady rhythm. He continues working in hunting and training in New York State, participating in programs related to nature and outdoor life. Time between tours is devoted to family and personal activities, completely separate from his performance image. At present, Eric Adams' presence does not lie in frequent appearances in mainstream media, but in the fact that he still steps onto the stage and maintains the role that has been attached to him for more than 4 decades. When the lights come on, that voice still opens the show in the familiar way. When the performance ends, he leaves the stage in silence, leaving behind a space that has been filled with the recognizable sound of his own voice. More than 4 decades have passed, and Eric Adams' journey is not marked by shocking turns or fleeting explosions. It extends along a persistent straight line. Step onto the stage, raise the voice, keep time for the band, then step back when the lights fade. The work repeats year after year, city after city, generation after generation of audiences, to the point that it becomes difficult to isolate a specific moment as a peak, because the endurance itself is what remains most memorable. In a musical world that constantly shifts, where many paths open and close quickly, he chose to remain within the structure that had nurtured him from the beginning. That choice was not loud, but it was clear enough to shape his entire professional life. A voice bound to a collective. A person bound to the stage. A rhythm of living inseparable from music. What lingers after everything is not a single song or a specific performance, but the familiar feeling each time the sound rises. For many, it is the memory of the first time standing beneath the stage. For others, it is a part of youth, tied to music, that did not change with time. And for those who came later, it is the chance to encounter a voice that has traveled across decades and still remains present. Eric Adams' journey continues in a quiet way. Tours following one another, stages lighting up and fading, the familiar voice resonating in the space to which he has devoted nearly an entire lifetime. The story does not rest in a single explosive moment, but in endurance stretched across many years, where one person chose to remain on his path, even as the musical world around him continually changed direction. Have you ever heard that voice resonate at a live show, or perhaps simply come to know Manowar during a particular chapter of your life? What do you remember most? A moment on stage, a specific song, or the feeling of a time not easily returned to? Leave your thoughts below. Don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next stories.